Martina Anderson's favourite place. The Hillsborough Agreement, which paved the way for the devolution of justice, promised to tackle the parades issue with new legislation and a replacement for the Parades Commission. The proposals for those new laws, however, have run into a barrage of criticism with complaints that they are in breach of basic human rights. The proposal that organisers must give 37 days' notice of any public gathering of more than 50 people would, say the critics, block the kind of demonstration that followed the murders of 2 soldiers and a policeman last year, or the workers' occupation of the doomed Vistion factory in Dunmurry, or the protests over White House Primary School in Belfast. So, should it be back to the drawing board? John O'Dowd, you were in that protest at the school. You were also one of the people drawing up these proposals. Here you are setting back the cause of human rights. No, well, that's not the case. The very fact of the case is we're at the drawing board. We're drawing up legislation. The most important board in this new legislation is draft. It's out to 12 weeks consultation. We want to hear the views of the trade union movement, of the residents' groups, of the marching orders, of interested citizens. So you set out to provoke them? All those examples you have given in your run into this interview, all those examples under current legislation would have to have applied under Public Order Act or else under the parades legislation for those demonstrations. Under the legislation we are proposing, people would still have to apply, and there is emergency provision within that legislation to allow people to apply. But remember what this legislation is about. It's about contentious parades, going back to the difficulties we have around loyal order marches and the rights of citizens to live free from sectarian harassment. They're not directed towards the trade union movement or against the broader right of citizens to protest. All right, well, Eamonn McCann, there you are. I mean, there are already restrictions. There's no difference.
Well, there is a difference. For a start, the notification that has to be given under this Act is 37 days, as you have said. In fact, it's more than 37 days, because of 37 working days, which are defined in the legislation, or the draft legislation, as being from Monday to Friday, other than public holidays. So it could be 8 weeks, 8.5 weeks. And of course, it is true that there is mention in the draft of emergency situations, where it could be 3 days. That can only be done if there is what's called an extreme emergency, and the word extreme is in the draft, and the Chief Constable would have to be consulted. But even 3 days, for example, there are occasions when people feel the need to protest without any waiting at all. For example, I was at a meeting of community groups in Derry just a few hours ago, and we were talking about the imminent closure, as we believe, of a residential home. We resolved that as soon as that happens, without waiting, we'll be outside that home and we'll call upon community groups in Derry to assemble. We would not be able to give notice. That would not be covered by the provisions of the bill. That actually would be actionable, and we'd be liable to 6 months imprisonment or a level 5 fine, which, as I understand it, is £5,000. That's what's in the draft, and it's no good John O'Dowd coming along here now and saying, well, actually, it's only a draft and we want to hear...
Well, it is only a draft.
Well, it is a draft legislation. It's a draft bill, which has been put out by the Office of First Minister and Deputy First Minister. Therefore, we have to take what's set down on paper very seriously.
No one thinks you just put out papers which have figures plucked out of hats. This is something that could go into legislation. Is the problem not that you have sought to use umbrella legislation to deal with the parades issue by burying it in general public gathering legislation?
Well, you see, there's a point to what you say, because the Orange Order on several occasions have tried to claim that their parades aren't actually parades, that they're meetings or they're church gatherings or they're public gatherings. So they've tried to put their orange marches under that. And residents are deeply concerned that if legislation goes forward, which allows that loophole in the law, then orange parades could go through areas where they're not wanted. So we have tried to have an all-encompassing legislation. But it is important to say, it's not just simply, this consultation isn't just simply for the optics. We want to ensure we have good legislation in place which protects the rights of all citizens. And the example which Eamonn uses of community groups going out to campaign against closures, etc., there is, but even within the current draft legislation, and if it can be improved, let's improve it. But there is, within the current draft legislation, Eamonn and his colleagues could go out in the morning, have that demonstration, and there would be no action taken against them. But if it can be improved, let's improve it.
Well, John says there'll be no action taken against us. Well, I mean, that's a hope. The fact is that under the provisions of this draft, action could be taken against us. Therefore, it is a significant curtailment on the right to organise and take part in that sort a public activity. What is more, I mean, it's no good just saying, well, it's about parades, but the Orange Order has, in the past said the parades aren't really parades, but something else. The fact of the matter is that the working group at Stormont, appointed by the First and Deputy First Ministers, was charged with responsibility to produce a document on parades. It said at Hillsborough, 5th of February, parades. It was said that the 6-person group, 3 Sinn Féin, 3 DUP, had been selected precisely because of their experience in handling parades. Yet, on the 20th of April, in the middle of an election campaign, out comes this document, which is not just dealing with parades, but one of the examples given in the body of the document, sort of an example of the type of activity which would come under this. It says, if there were protests against the closure of a sporting facility. That's 1,000,000 miles away from the Garvaghey Road, isn't it? That would require the 37 days notice. Now, that's absolute nonsense. That is a significant curtailment on civil rights. And I'll tell you what, if this had happened a few years ago, John would have been out alongside me with a placard in his hand protesting.
Well,
fair point.
What I would be doing, Eamonn, is I would be ensuring that there was a detailed response made to the legislation. I think that's the onus on yourself and others.
Oh, we will be making it in the trade union movement.
I welcome it. But let me be clear about this. The 37-day comes from residents who are opposed to orange marches through their areas wanted a longer period of notification around those parades. And there's others who wanted to ensure
they come back to
protest.
the same point. Now it applies to everybody, which is a nonsense.
The current public order legislation applies to everyone, and the parades legislation applies. We had the example. Let me just finish this point. We had the example in Bangor, where a circus parade had to be stopped because they didn't notify for a parade. We have the cases of vintage car clubs who have to notify for parades. So the current legislation is all-encompassing. You mightn't like that. That's the case.
But the
that's
human
not
rights...
what's envisaged here. It's quite clear from the wording of it, from the context in which it was produced, that you're not thinking, that the working group is not thinking of circus parades or vintage cars or anything like that. As I say, it gives the example of a protest against a closure of a sporting facility. And right throughout the document, it is clear that they mean public meetings and demonstrations to do with matters of public interest. And the reason why we have mentioned, and I have mentioned in the past, of trade unions and community groups is this, sort of that over the coming period, where there's going to be savage cuts right across the board, you can anticipate, John, that there is going to be widespread resistance and widespread demonstrations.
Yes.
And you don't have to be particularly paranoid to think that it's in the context of that expectation that the working group extended their remit from parades right across the board.
That is complete rubbish, because you see, when those demonstrations take place against the cuts, we will be on the streets with you, as we have been in the past, and we will be demonstrating against those cuts. So it is being paranoid to say. It is being paranoid.
Come on. You can't pass budgets to make cuts inevitable and then turn up with a placard protesting against them.
Because you set yourself up as the rebel without a cause does not make you the only socialist.
I have not. I've got a cause, and my cause is to try to get this document withdrawn.
Just a second, the Human Rights Commission has made a response to this, and it says that there's no evidence, or where is the evidence that the 37 days is required? How does it meet pressing social need? How is it proportionate to the interests of national security, public safety, and the protection of human rights and freedoms? That's the European Convention Human Rights, Article 11.
All legislation in relation to public assemblies has to flow from the European human rights legislation, because the right to assembly is enshrined in that. But all European countries put infringements on it.
But the Human Rights Commission says it seems to contravene.
Well, the Human Rights Commission has made a submission, like other people have, and the Human Rights Commission is an important body which has to be listened to. What we are saying is very clear. The legislation, if it can be improved, will be improved. But there's one thing missing from Eamonn's argument. How do you protect isolated nationalist communities from unwanted orange marches? Because under Eamonn's remit, they can march wherever they want.
Right.
That's absolutely untrue, and you know quite well, John, sort of that I have not been a bit backward about coming forward, sort of, and confronting.
But a legislative solution
in the past. There's already legislation there. There's a parades commission, and the reason why it has been abolished is that the DUP insisted at Hillsborough that if they were
going to be abolished. So what's your solution in the new realities?
My solution sort of is ordinary public order considerations, and that people are sort of storming around the place and attacking. Yes, indeed, that applies to trade unions. And incidentally, John, I will not allow you to sit there and say that Eamonn McCann is a rebel without a cause. Anything that I'm rebelling about here in relation to this document has good cause, as the Human Rights Commission has said. And what is more, if I've rebelled against causes down through the years, there was a time, John, before your party got into the executive, when you would have been with me rebelling on these issues, but you've changed your tune since you got your backside on executive seats.
You see, when you come up with a plausible cause, and there's a number of plausible causes you're involved in, we'll support you. But when you go around creating fear around parades, against
this is
legislation.
very
I'm not
unfair.
creating
And you
fear.
can't-
The Human Rights
I'm
Commission
sorry,
is saying this. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions is
Eamonn
saying
McCann. The
this.
trade unions have complained. The European...
But the question
the
goes
Human
out to
Rights
all those
Commission
groups.
has objections.
The Human Rights Commission have valid concerns around, and those will have to be taken on board. But when people come forward and they say, let's scrap this legislation, I have a question for them. How do we protect isolated nationalist communities from unwanted orange marches? And they need to answer that question.
I tell you, if that was your concern, and that's the one that you brought up, and you've now brought it up twice, if that was your concern, you should have dealt sort of with the parades issue, as was the remit of this working group, and it was appointed. As the Human Rights Commission says, there is no explanation has come from you or anybody else as to why it was necessary and what was the thought process which led the working group to extend its own remit right across the board. No, you haven't.
Well, let me ask you this. You've talked about it being draft, 37 days. From what you know from the complaints from the Human Rights Commission, from trade unions, from people like Eamonn McCann, do you think, oh, that was a wrong one, we'll change that?
The Human Rights Commission have made a complaint. They've made a submission, as they are constituted to do so. The trade union movement have raised serious questions here, which all deserve to be answered, and I've outlined some of them here. 37 days comes from the residence groups.
All right. Gentlemen, this will continue. Thank you very much indeed. That's where we leave it.